Welcome to Talk Tickers.
It's great to be back.
Usually we're here breaking down the latest earnings calls, dissecting guidance, and, trying to figure out if a CEO is sweating through their shirt during the Q&A.
We live and breathe the quarter-to-quarter grind.
Exactly. But today, we're doing something a little different. We are zooming all the way out. We're doing a comprehensive retrospective on one of the most significant financial pileups of the 21st century.
It's an event that, it fundamentally changed how we look at sovereign risk, banking integration, and really the entire concept of a currency union. We're talking about the European sovereign debt crisis, or as it's often just called, the Eurozone crisis.
And just to set the stakes here, because it's been a few years and memory can fade, this wasn't just a recession. This wasn't a case of, GDP went down 1%.
No, not at all.
This was a moment starting around 2009 where we legitimately stared down the barrel of sovereign nations within the EU, developed modern economies, facing the very real possibility of not being able to repay or refinance their government debt.
It threatened to unravel the entire euro currency project.
Which would have been catastrophic. If the euro breaks, the global financial system essentially has a heart attack. There's no other way to put it.
Absolutely. It was, at its core, a structural clash. You had a monetary union, so one currency, the euro, managed by one central bank in Frankfurt, colliding head-on with independent fiscal policies.
Right, so you've got 17 different governments with 17 different ideas about taxes and spending.
Exactly. Different economies, different cultures, all sharing the same credit card with no shared bank account to back it up.
We often hear about the PIIs in this context. It's a pretty unflattering acronym.
It is. It stands for Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain. They were the ones in the eye of the storm.
But the big picture takeaway here, and this is what we want to dig into, isn't just some countries spent too much. It's much more complex.
It's about the very architecture of Europe. It's about massive trade imbalances. And, it's about how a crisis in a relatively small economy like Greece could threaten to take down the entire global financial system.
So let's unpack this. Where do we even start? This crisis didn't just appear out of nowhere in 2009.
No, it starts well before that. To really understand the crash, you have to understand the setup. We have to go back to what some call the illusion of convergence that happened between, say, 1999 and 2008.
Okay, the illusion of convergence.
But the legal foundation, the rule book, goes back even further to the Maastricht Treaty of 1992.
Right, the document that basically said, if you want to be in the club, here are the rules you have to follow. It was the entry ticket to the euro.
Precisely. The Maastricht Treaty established these so-called golden rules for joining. If you wanted to replace your pesetas or drachmas or lira with the shiny new euro, you had to promise to be fiscally disciplined.
And what did that mean specifically?
Well, there were two big ones. First, your annual budget deficit couldn't exceed 3% of your GDP.
Okay, so you can't spend way more than you take in each year.
And second, your total outstanding public debt couldn't be more than 60% of your GDP.
Sounds prudent on paper. Keep your spending in check, keep your overall debt manageable. It's like a mortgage application. You need a certain debt-to-income ratio to get the house.
It does sound prudent. But here's where the first crack in the foundation appears.
Did anyone actually follow these rules?
That's the thing. In practice, these rules were treated more like suggestions than ironclad laws. The enforcement failure was immediate and significant.
So they were bent from the start.
Bent and broken. And here is the kicker. It wasn't just the peripheral countries breaking them. We often think of the core countries like Germany and France as the disciplined schoolmasters of Europe.
Right, the ones wagging their fingers.
Well, in 2002 and 2003, both Germany and France violated the 3% deficit rule.
Wait, so the core countries, the ones who basically wrote the rules and were running the show, broke their own rules right out of the gate.
They did. And crucially, they faced zero punishment. They used their political muscle to get the other countries to waive the fines and sanctions that were supposed to be automatic.
Wow. So that just fatally weakens the entire framework from day one.
It sends a message, right? The rules are political, not mathematical. If the biggest, most powerful economies don't have to follow the rules, why should the smaller ones?
It's a terrible precedent.
It's worse than that. You had countries like Italy and Belgium that were allowed to join the euro in the first place despite having debt levels way, way above the 60% limit.
So the entry criteria were fudged.
Completely fudged. The motivation was deeply political, not purely economic. The grand project was a unified Europe. project of peace and integration after centuries of war. And to get everyone into that big tent, they were willing to look the other way on the numbers.
They just assumed it would all work out in the end.
They assumed that once everyone was using the same currency, their economies would just naturally converge, that Italy would start to look more like Germany over time.
And for a while, it seemed like it was working, right? The rules are soft, but then the euro launches in 1999, and for the next 8 years or so, things looked great on the surface.
It looked like a massive success.
Yeah.
But underneath, it was creating this enormous distortion. And that brings us to what the market called the implicit Germany guarantee.
Okay, explain that, because this is where I get stuck. You had the smartest people in finance at Goldman Sachs, at Deutsche Bank, looking at Greek bonds in, say, 2005.
Right.
They knew Greece wasn't Germany. They knew the productivity numbers weren't the same. They knew tax collection was, let's call it optional in some sectors. So why on earth did the market treat Greek government debt as being just as safe as German government debt?
That is the trillion euro caution, isn't it? It wasn't blindness. It was a very specific bet on the political will of Europe. Traders called it the halo effect.
The halo effect.
The theory was that simply being in the Eurozone club conferred German levels of safety onto your debt. The market wasn't really pricing Greek risk. They were pricing the risk of Germany letting the entire Euro project collapse.
So they were betting on a bailout before the crisis even started. They assumed there was no divorce clause.
Precisely. The assumption was if you lend money to Greece, you're really lending to the entire Euro project. And the German taxpayer ultimately was the backstop. If push came to shove, Germany would never let a member state fail.
And the banks were incentivized to believe this, weren't they?
Oh, massively incentivized. This is crucial. Under the banking capital rules at the time, Basel II sovereign debt of any Eurozone country was rated as zero risk.
Zero risk. So a bank doesn't have to hold any capital against it. If I'm a French bank, I can buy €1 billion of Italian bonds, and I don't need to set aside a single euro in case they go bad.
Zero. Nothing. So think about that trade. If you're a German bank, you can borrow money at 2%, buy Greek government bonds paying 4%, and you pocket that 2% spread with basically infinite leverage because the regulator tells you the asset is risk-free.
It was the easiest money on the street.
It was the ultimate convergence trade, and the effect was dramatic. The interest rates or the yields on bonds from Greece, Spain, Ireland, Portugal, they all collapsed. They converged downwards to match the ultra-low rates of Germany.
So suddenly, these countries that historically had to pay very high interest rates to borrow money now had access to a virtually unlimited credit card with almost zero interest.
It's like giving a college student an Amex Black card and telling them, don't worry, your rich uncle in Berlin is co-signing for everything.
And what do you do with a cheap credit card? You spend.
You spend. And that cheap money fueled massive, massive booms. But the nature of the boom really varied by country, and we need to be specific here because it's important.
Okay, so it wasn't one size fits all.
Not at all. In Greece, the government was the primary beneficiary. They used that cheap credit to go on a hiring spree in the public sector, to jack up public sector wages, and to fund extremely generous pension benefits.
I remember seeing the numbers. Public wages in Greece doubled in real terms over about 10 years.
They did. That was a classic case of fiscal profligacy, funded by artificially cheap debt.
But in Ireland and Spain, it was a different story, wasn't it? The narrative often gets lazy and just says everyone overspent, but their governments were actually pretty responsible before the crisis.
That's correct. In fact, both Ireland and Spain were running budget surpluses before 2008. They were the poster children for fiscal discipline.
So what happened there?
In Ireland and Spain, that cheap money flowed into the private sectors, specifically into real estate. It fueled two of the biggest housing bubbles in modern history.
Cranes everywhere.
Cranes everywhere. Construction exploded. Ghost estates were being built in the middle of nowhere in Ireland. The Spanish coastline was just a wall of condos. So you had these booming economies, but they were built on a completely unsustainable foundation of artificially cheap credit. It was an illusion of wealth.
And this brings us right to the deep structural fault lines. You mentioned it earlier, the idea of a monetary union without a fiscal union. This seems to be the original sin of the whole Eurozone project.
It absolutely is. It's the central contradiction that the crisis exposed. When you join the euro, you make a huge sacrifice. You give up your independent monetary policy.
Meaning you can't print your own money anymore.
You can't print money to pay your debts, and maybe even more importantly, you can't control your exchange rate. You cannot devalue your currency to make your exports cheaper and regain competitiveness.
Let me play devil's advocate for a second. The United States has a single currency, the dollar. Mississippi and New York share that currency, and they have vastly different economies. Why doesn't the U.S. have a Mississippi sovereign debt crisis every few years?
That's the perfect comparison, and it reveals exactly what the Eurozone was missing. There are two huge reasons. First is labor mobility.
People can just move.
If the economy tanks in Mississippi, people pack up and move to Texas or New York or California for work. It's not easy, but it happens. In Europe, despite the open borders, that's much harder.
Language barriers, cultural differences.
Pension portability, professional licensing, all sorts of barriers. A Greek unemployed worker can't just easily move to Frankfurt and start working the next day.
Yeah.
Labor is much, much stickier.
Okay, that's one reason. What's the second?
Fiscal transfers. This is the big one. This is the automatic shock absorber. If Mississippi has a terrible year, Washington, D.C. automatically, without any debate, pumps money in.
How?
Through unemployment benefits, food stamps, federal aid, Social Security payments. The federal tax and benefit system acts as an automatic stabilizer. The rich states, like New York and California, implicitly subsidize the poorer states.
Right. New York tax dollars end up paying for roads and schools in Mississippi.
And nobody really complains because they're all Americans. It's just part of being a single country. The Eurozone had none of that plumbing. There was no Federal Treasury of Europe to send checks to Athens when their economy slumped.
So when the shock hit, Greece was trapped.
Completely trapped in a straitjacket.
Yeah.
They couldn't devalue their currency because they didn't have one anymore. They couldn't get a federal transfer because the mechanism didn't exist. Their only option was a brutal internal adjustment.
Before we get to the shock itself, let's talk about the competitiveness cap. Because while the South was having this credit-fueled party, what was Germany up to?
This is such a crucial piece of the puzzle. While the periphery was enjoying this massive boom, Germany was going through a period of painful economic reform, the so-called Hartz reforms.
They were tightening their belts.
Massively. They were practicing extreme wage restraint. German workers, through their unions, accepted very, very low wage growth for years in order to keep German industry hyper-competitive on the global stage. They effectively devalued internally.
So Germany becomes this incredible export machine?
The export machine of Europe. They built up enormous trade surpluses. They were selling far more to the world than they were buying.
And then the South?
The exact opposite. In countries like Greece and Spain, wages were rising much faster than productivity. That meant their goods and services became more and more expensive and uncompetitive, especially compared to German goods.
So they started importing everything.
They ended up importing way more than they exported, running huge trade deficits year after year. And how do you pay for a trade deficit?
You have to borrow the money from someone else.
You borrow. And who are they borrowing from? They were borrowing the capital from the countries running the surpluses, mainly Germany. So you had this massive flow of capital from north to south to finance all this consumption.
So it's not just a government debt story.
Not at all. Many economists will tell you this wasn't primarily a fiscal crisis about government budgets. It was fundamentally a balance of payments crisis, driven by these huge unsustainable trade imbalances within the Eurozone itself.
Which connects back to that classic economic theory, the impossible trinity, right?
Yes, exactly. The theory states you can't have all three of these things at the same time. A fixed exchange rate, free movement of capital, and an autonomous monetary policy. You can only pick two.
And the Eurozone's choice was?
They locked the exchange rates together by creating a single currency. And they created free movement of capital, which meant, by definition, that individual countries had to give up all monetary autonomy. They had no tools left to respond to local shocks.
And when the shock came, they were completely defenseless.
Defenseless. And boy, did the shock come.
Okay, let's move to it. Section 3, the catalyst and the crash. We're looking at 2008 to 2010. The global financial crisis ignites in the U.S. with subprime mortgages and the collapse of Lehman Brothers. How did that fire jump across the Atlantic and specifically burn down the house in Greece?
The 2008 crisis was the spark that lit the fuse. When Lehman Brothers collapsed in September 2008, risk aversion returned to the global markets with an absolute vengeance.
The party was over.
The party was over. Suddenly, investors who had been blissfully ignoring risk for years woke up. They remembered that a Greek bond and a German bond were, in fact, issued by two very different governments with two very different tax bases and two very different histories of repayment.
The implicit Germany guarantee just vanished overnight.
It evaporated. You saw a flight to safety. Capital fled the periphery and flooded back into the core, especially into safe German government bonds. And as a result, the borrowing costs, the bond yields in the periphery began to spike upwards.
So Lehman collapses in September '08. The tide goes out, and suddenly, to use Warren Buffett's phrase, we see who's been swimming naked. But the trigger in Europe wasn't immediate, right? There was this strange lull for about a year.
There was. It was the calm before the storm. The specific date you need to circle on your calendar is October 2009. A new socialist government, PSOK, comes into power in Athens.
Yeah.
They walk into the Ministry of Finance, they open the drawers, they look at the real books, and they essentially say, oh my God.
This is the famous deficit revision. This is the moment everything changed.
It's the confession.
Yeah.
They went public and announced that the previous government's numbers were, well, a work of fiction. The budget deficit for 2009 wasn't going to be around 6%, which was already bad.
What was it?
It was revised up to 12.7%. And they said even that number might be too low. It eventually settled over 15%.
That is a shocking revision. From an investor's perspective, that's like a company admitting they've been cooking the books for years.
That's exactly what it was. And politically, you can understand why they did it. They wanted to pin all the blame on the previous administration. Look at this horrendous mess we inherited.
But they completely miscalculated the market's reaction.
Completely. They thought they'd get sympathy. Instead, they got a bond vigilante firing squad. The market didn't just see a bigger deficit, they saw a lie. It was a credibility shock. If the deficit number was fake, what else was fake? The GDP number, tax revenue data.
Trust just evaporated.
Evaporated overnight. And the rating agencies, Fitch, S&P, Moody's, they reacted with incredible speed and aggression.
They started the downgrades.
A whole series of them, one after another, pushing Greek debt down, 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 eventually into junk status. And that's a huge problem because many institutional investors, like pension funds, are legally forbidden from holding junk bonds. They were forced to sell, which pushed yields even higher, creating a death spiral.
But we have to be careful, as you said earlier, not to paint everyone with the same Greek brush. The crisis had very different flavors in different countries.
Very different. And it's so important to make these distinctions.
I really want to separate Ireland from the pack here, because the popular narrative is often lazy Southerners spending too much money. But Ireland was the Celtic tiger. As you said, they were running budget surpluses. They were the poster child of austerity before the crash.
Ireland is the ultimate tragedy of the private sector. Their government was actually very prudent leading up to 2008. But their banks were running an out-of-control casino.
Fueled by that cheap euro credit.
Exactly. They were borrowing cheaply from German and French banks and lending it out hand over fist for insane property developments. When the global property bubble burst, Irish banks were instantly insolvent. They had lent billions for projects that were now just worthless fields.
And this is where the Irish government made what is arguably the single most expensive decision in the history of the state.
Late September 2008. The infamous bank guarantee. The Irish government, terrified of a full-scale bank run, panicked. They stepped in and said, we guarantee everything.
Not just customer deposits up to a certain limit.
No, everything. All the liabilities of the 6 main Irish banks, the bonds held by sophisticated German and French investors, everything. They put the Irish taxpayer on the hook for every single bad bet the banks had made.
What was the number? How much did they guarantee?
The total was around 440 billion euros. Now, for context, Ireland's entire GDP at the time was roughly 180 billion euros.
So they guaranteed more than double the size of their entire national economy in a single night.
It's an almost incomprehensible number. It's the decision that dragged the sovereign down. The Irish state was solvent, the banks dragged it underwater. It wasn't a crisis of fiscal irresponsibility. It was a banking suicide pact that the taxpayers were forced to join.
And the deficit just exploded?
It ballooned to over 30% of GDP in 1 year, almost purely because of the cost of bailing out Anglo-Irish Bank and the others. The government budget didn't blow up because they were hiring teachers. It blew up because they socialized private gambling debts.
And Spain had a similar, though not identical, story.
Yes. Spain also had a massive housing bubble, and their specific problem was the cajas, which were regional savings banks. They were often poorly managed, politically connected, and massively overexposed to the real estate crash.
And again, the government had to step in.
They had to. So again, a crisis of high private debt became a public burden. Italy, on the other hand, was different again.
Right. Italy didn't have a housing bubble, and their private debt levels were actually quite low.
Italy's problem was chronic. It was two things: decades of accumulated high public debt and close to zero economic growth for over a decade. They were stuck. And their biggest problem was just their size. They were simply too big to save. The bailout funds that were eventually created were big enough for Greece or Ireland, but not for Italy.
Okay, so we have these different fires burning across the periphery. Let's get to the core of why this became a systemic crisis. Why couldn't the rest of Europe just, wall off Greece and let it default? It's a tiny part of the European economy, about 2%. Why did it matter so much to a powerhouse like Germany or France?
This is where we get into the mechanics of contagion. It comes down to two key concepts: the doom loop and interconnected financial exposure.
The doom loop. It sounds like a summer blockbuster movie, but in finance, it's usually less entertaining and a lot more terrifying. Walk us through how it works.
It's a vicious, self-reinforcing cycle. Step one: banks in a country, say Italy, hold a lot of their own government's bonds. Italian government bonds are considered a safe asset, a core part of their capital reserves.
Okay, that makes sense.
Step two: the Italian government starts to look shaky. The market gets nervous, and the value of those Italian government bonds starts to fall.
Right. Yields go up, price goes down.
Step three: now the Italian banks start to look shaky because a core asset on their balance sheet is losing value. Suddenly, they look undercapitalized, maybe even insolvent.
Step four: if the banks look like they're about to collapse, who has to step in and save them?
The government.
The Italian government has to bail out the Italian banks.
Exactly. Step five: bailing out the banks costs a fortune, which makes the government's own financial situation even worse. The government looks even shapier.
Which causes the value of their bonds to fall further, which hurts the banks more, which requires a bigger bailout.
And round and round you go, down the drain. The health of the banks and the health of the sovereign become inextricably linked in a downward spiral. That's the doom loop.
And it wasn't just a domestic problem. This loop crossed borders.
Massively. This is the interconnected exposure part. It turned out that French and German banks were some of the biggest holders of peripheral debt. They had lent hundreds of billions to Greece, to Spain, to Italy, to Portugal.
So if Greece defaulted,
French and German banks would take a colossal hit on their balance sheets. If Italy defaulted, which was a much bigger economy, the French banking system could have been rendered insolvent. The German banking system, led by Deutsche Bank, would have been on the brink.
So this is financial contagion. The sickness in Athens could kill the banks in Paris and Frankfurt.
That's why they couldn't just let Greece go. It was never just about Greece. It was about saving their own banking systems. You also had the role of derivatives, specifically credit default swaps or CDS.
Which are basically insurance policies an investor can buy against a borrower defaulting.
Yes. And as the crisis got worse, the price of buying that insurance on, say, Greek or Italian debt just skyrocketed. This became a public signal of panic.
It's like seeing the odds on a horse suddenly change dramatically.
Right. And it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Investors look at the soaring CDS prices and think, wow, the smart money thinks Italy is going to default. So they panic and sell their Italian bonds, which of course makes an Italian default more likely.
So the house is on fire in multiple rooms. And the neighbors, the other European countries, are watching. Let's move to Section 5, the institutional response, or maybe the initial lack of one.
Right.
You have the house on fire, and the neighbors, Germany, France, the Netherlands, are standing on the lawn arguing about who should pay for the water and what kind of hose to use. Why the hesitation? Why not just have the ECD print the money and put the fire out immediately like the Fed did in the U.S.?
One phrase sums up the entire German position: moral hazard.
Moral hazard, the idea that if you bail someone out of a mistake, they'll just keep making mistakes.
It was an absolute obsession for Angela Merkel and the German political establishment. Their view was, if we just write a blank check for the Greeks after they lied about their deficit and overspent for a decade, what lesson did the Italians learn? What did the Portuguese learn?
They learned that no matter what, Daddy will always pay the credit card bill.
Exactly. So the initial strategy, driven by Germany, was to make any potential rescue as painful and humiliating as possible. They wanted the punishment to be visible so that no one else would ever want to bail out.
They were trying to teach a lesson and enforce discipline while the entire market was collapsing around them.
A terrible time for a lecture. And remember, legally, their hands were tied. The Maastricht Treaty, the founding document, contained a very explicit no bailout clause. It was legally forbidden for one member state to assume the debts of another.
So they were trapped by their own rules.
They had to literally bypass their own laws to save the currency. It led to months and months of decision paralysis. You had 17 member states, and for these major decisions, you needed unanimity.
Imagine trying to get 17 people to agree on where to order pizza for dinner, but if you don't agree in the next hour, the restaurant burns down.
That's a perfect analogy. And so the decisions they did make were always slow, always compromised, and almost always too little, too late. They were constantly behind the curve of the market panic.
And the ECB, the European Central Bank, the U.S. Federal Reserve was slashing interest rates, launching quantitative easing, printing money. Where was the ECB in all this?
The ECB was in an ideological straitjacket. As we touched on before, unlike the Fed, which has a dual mandate to control inflation and maximize employment, the ECB has a single holy mandate: inflation control.
They were inflation hawks, above all else.
Obsessed with it. They were terrified that acting as a lender of last resort for governments would be inflationary, or that it would violate the treaties. The head of the German Bundesbank was constantly warning against it, so they hesitated for a very long time.
But eventually they were forced to act, and this is where we see the creation of the Troika. It sounds like something out of a Cold War spy novel.
The Men in Black, as they were called in Athens, is a group formed by the European Commission, the European Central Bank, the ECB, and the International Monetary Fund, the IMF.
And their job was to manage the bailouts.
To manage the bailouts and enforce the conditions. They created temporary bailout funds, like the EFSF, and later a permanent one, the ESM, to lend money to countries that had been shut out of the bond markets.
But the money came with very strict strings attached. This is where the word austerity enters the global vocabulary.
Yes. The conditionality was brutal. In exchange for the loans, countries had to implement severe austerity programs designed by the Troika.
What did that look like on the ground?
Drastic cuts to public spending, slashing pensions, firing government workers, huge tax increases on a population already in a recession, and so-called structural reforms, which mainly meant labor market reforms designed to lower wages.
This is the concept of internal devaluation. It's a very sterile economic term, but what does it actually feel like for the people living through it?
It feels like the Great Depression. Since you can't devalue your currency to make your exports cheaper, the logic is you have to devalue your entire economy. You have to make your people cheaper.
You slash wages by 20 or 30%. You cut pensions in half. You gut public services. The explicit goal is to destroy domestic demand.
The logic was, if we can force wages and prices down, we can become competitive again on the export market.
But the human cost.
The cost was immense, and economically it created a vicious negative feedback loop. The austerity sucked money and demand out of the economy, which drove these countries into even deeper recessions.
Which lowers GDP.
Which lowers GDP. And since the key metric everyone is watching is the debt to GDP ratio, shrinking the denominator, the GDP paradoxically made the debt ratio look even worse in the short term.
It's like trying to lose weight by cutting off your leg. Sure, you weigh less on the scale, but you can't walk anymore.
That's a very good way to put it. And by 2012, this strategy had pushed the Eurozone to the absolute breaking point.
Let's go there. Section 6, the turning point. By the summer of 2012, things were looking incredibly grim.
This was peak panic. By June and July of 2012, the borrowing costs for Spain and Italy were reaching unsustainable levels. Yields on their 10-year bonds were approaching 7%.
And 7% is generally considered the point of no return, right? The level where the interest payments themselves become so high that a country mathematically cannot pay them back. It's a death spiral.
It is. And speculation was absolutely rife that the Eurozone was about to break up. The term Grexit, the idea of a Greek exit from the euro, was on the front page of every newspaper. People feared it would trigger a domino effect. If Greece leaves, who's next? Portugal, Spain.
The entire project was on the verge of collapse. And then one man walked up to a podium in London and changed everything.
July 26, 2012. Mario Draghi, the then president of ECB, he was an Italian, which was significant. He gave a speech at a conference in London. And he wasn't really speaking to the politicians or the academics in the room. He was speaking directly to the hedge funds and the bond traders who were betting billions against the euro.
And he said the three most important words of the entire crisis.
He said, within our mandate, the ECB is ready to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro. And believe me, it will be enough.
Whatever it takes, just 3 words.
It changed market psychology in an instant. It was a thunderbolt. He backed it up with a specific policy announcement a few weeks later, a program called OMT Outright Monetary Transactions.
And what was that?
It was basically a promise. The ECB promised that it would buy unlimited amounts of the sovereign bonds of any distressed country like Spain or Italy, provided that country first applied for a formal bailout program and agreed to its conditions.
So he essentially put the full unlimited firepower of the central bank's printing press on the table. He took out the bazooka and laid it on the table for everyone to see.
That's exactly what he did. He was saying to the markets, do not bet against the euro because we have deeper pockets than you. We can print infinite money. You can't.
And the most amazing thing is, they never actually had to fire the bazooka.
Never. The OMT program was never actually triggered. Not a single bond was ever bought under it. The mere threat of it, the credibility of the promise that the ECB would act, was enough to calm the markets.
The bluff worked.
Yields for Spain and Italy collapsed. The panic subsided. Stability, slowly but surely, started to return.
It's incredible how much of high finance is just psychology and confidence. He didn't spend a single euro, he just changed the story.
It's probably the single most successful and powerful piece of central bank communication in modern history.
So the immediate heart attack was stopped, the patient was stabilized, but they were still in the intensive care unit for a long time. Let's look at the specific country outcomes in Section 7. Greece, in particular, had an incredibly rough ride, even after 2012.
Greece was the tragedy of the crisis. They went through something called PSI, private sector involvement. This was, for all intents and purposes, a sovereign bankruptcy.
What did it entail?
It was a negotiated default. Private bondholders, banks, hedge funds, pension funds were forced to take a haircut. They had to accept a write-down of approximately 53.5% on the face value of their Greek government bonds.
That is massive. So if you owned €1 million of Greek bonds, you woke up one morning and they were worth less than half that.
You lost more than half your money. And the recession that followed was of a scale not seen in a developed country since the 1930s.
What were the numbers like?
GDP contracted by over 25% from its peak. Unemployment hit 27%. Youth unemployment went over 50%. It was a genuine humanitarian crisis within the borders of the European Union. Hospitals ran out of basic medicine. There were stories of people starving. It was brutal.
Ireland and Spain, on the other hand, fared better eventually. They're often held up as the success stories of the crisis.
Success is a very relative term here. But yes, compared to the disaster in Greece, they were successful. Both countries completed their bailout programs. Ireland in 2013, Spain in 2014, and managed to return to economic growth.
How do they do it?
They took the bitter medicine, they did the brutal internal devaluation, they slashed wages, they reformed their economies, and their exports did eventually recover, helped by a recovering global economy. But it came at a huge social cost.
The unemployment numbers were still terrible for years.
Staggeringly high for a very long time. As we said, youth unemployment in Spain peaked at over 50%. Overall unemployment was over 26%. It created a lost generation of young people.
And there was one other weird specific crisis in Cyprus in 2013.
Cyprus was unique and set a very worrying precedent. Their banking sector was enormous relative to their tiny economy, bloated with money from Russia. When their banks collapsed and they needed a bailout, the Troika imposed a new kind of condition.
The bail-in.
The bail-in. Instead of just the taxpayers footing the entire bill, they forced losses directly onto the bank's creditors, including large depositors.
So they just took money out of people's bank accounts.
If you had over 100,000 euros in a Cypriot bank account, you woke up one morning to find a significant portion of your money was just gone. It had been converted into worthless bank stock to recapitalize the bank. It sent a shockwave of fear through depositors all across Europe. Suddenly, your money in the bank wasn't 100% secret anymore.
That brings us to the aftermath. Section 8, Lessons Learned and Structural Reforms. We're a decade plus out from the peak of the crisis. Did they actually fix the roof while the sun was shining?
They did some major renovations, yes. But you could argue the fundamental design of the house still has some issues. The single biggest and most important reform was the creation of the banking union.
What was the logic there?
They finally recognized that you can't have a single currency area with 18 different national bank regulators. It doesn't work. You can't trust a local Spanish regulator to be tough on a local Spanish bank that's making bad loans. They'll just look the other way to protect their national champion.
So supervision had to be centralized.
It had to be European. So they established the Single Supervisory Mechanism, or SSM, which put the ECB in charge of supervising all the major banks across the Eurozone. It was a huge step towards breaking that doom loop.
And they also tried to tighten the budget rules, the original Maastricht criteria that had been so badly ignored.
They did. They introduced a raft of new regulations with terrible names like the 2-pack and the 6-pack.
Sounds like you're ordering beer at a bar.
It does. But what they do is give the European Commission in Brussels much more power to oversee national budgets. Now, national budgets have to be submitted to the Commission for review before they're even passed by their own national parliaments.
That's a significant loss of national sovereignty.
It is. It's a trade-off. It's giving up a piece of your sovereignty in exchange for greater financial stability for the whole system.
Let's talk about the lingering scars, though. Because if I look at a chart of the U.S. economic recovery post-2008 versus the Eurozone recovery, they look like they're from different planets.
That is the damning metric, isn't it? The U.S., for all its flaws, chose stimulus. It was messy, but it worked. The economy started growing again fairly quickly. The Eurozone chose austerity.
And the result?
The Eurozone plunged into a double-dip recession in 2012-2013, just as the U.S. was recovering. The crisis left a permanent wedge, a permanent gap between the growth trajectories of the North, like Germany, and the South. That growth gap is real, and it has persisted. Germany recovered much faster and more strongly than Italy or Greece ever did.
And the political fallout has been immense. We are still living with it today.
Absolutely. You cannot inflict that level of economic pain. You cannot have 50% youth unemployment in a modern democracy and expect the political system to remain stable. It's impossible.
This is the direct through line to the rise of populism and Euroscepticism across the continent.
It is. The populist and nationalist movements of the last decade were born in the ashes of the austerity policies of 2011 and 2012. The feeling in Italy, in Greece, in Spain that Brussels and Berlin don't care about us. They care more about their banks than our jobs.
So while the financial crisis was eventually contained, the political consensus that held Europe together was shattered.
It was badly, badly damaged. The rise of parties like Syriza in Greece or the Five-Star Movement in Italy is directly linked to the anger people felt about the diktats from the Troika.
Okay, so let's bring it all together for our final synthesis. If there's one core takeaway our listeners should get from this deep dive, what is it?
The Eurozone crisis was a brutal, painful lesson in the dangers of half measures. It proved, beyond any doubt, that sharing a credit card, the single currency, without also sharing a bank account, some form of fiscal union or shared risk, is an inherently unstable arrangement.
The crisis ultimately showed that the political will to save the euro was there. They did do whatever it took. But the immense social and economic cost was paid almost entirely by the citizens of the peripheral nations in the form of lost jobs, lost businesses, and lost years of growth.
That's right. And while the acute phase of the crisis is over, those fundamental structural debates are still very much alive. The arguments about Eurobonds, about fiscal transfers, about how much risk rich countries should share with poorer countries, those debates are still happening every single day in the financial markets and in the halls of power in Brussels.
So the architecture is better, it's stronger, but the fundamental tension at the heart of the project remains.
It absolutely does.
A sobering but fascinating look at how the complex machinery of modern Europe almost ground to a complete halt. It really makes you realize that currencies aren't just paper or numbers on a screen, they're social contracts. And when that contract is tested, things can get very ugly very fast.
Well said.
That is it for this deep dive on Top Tickers. Thank you for listening.
We'll see you on the next call.